One of the theories that some have considered kind of far-fetched, but I think it's something you got to look at, is the theory of Leslie Dillon and the Astor Motel. An author by the name of Pio Eatwell, I apologize if I pronounced that wrong, wrote a book in 2017 titled Black Dahlia, Red Rose. And I got to tell you, it's a good read. It's a solid read. Whether or not the stuff in there is true, I don't know, but it's very compelling the way she puts it together. According to Eatwell, the criminal psychiatrist for the LAPD, a Dr. Paul DeRiver, set a trap for whoever the killer of Elizabeth was in a magazine called True Detective. He set the trap in an article he wrote, hoping to kind of weed out whoever did it. And before long, a letter arrived at Dr. DeRiver's office coming from someone by the name of Jack Sand. And essentially, Jack Sand claims in the letter that he knows who killed the Black Dahlia, and it is a friend of his by the name of Jeff Connors. So as correspondence continued between Dr. DeRiver and this Jack Sand, we come to find out the real identity of Jack Sand is Leslie Dillon. So as it turned out, the doctor and gangster squad, Detective J.J. O'Mara, finally got together with this Leslie Dillon and tried to get more information out of him. Apparently, he knew the two details that the cops were keeping close to the vest in regards to what was done with the tattoo and what was done with the pubic hair. While interviewing Leslie Dillon, he suggested that the murder was done in a bathtub to drain the blood. So Leslie Dillon and Mark Hansen, according to Eatwell's book, were somehow seen and spotted at the Astor Motel, as well as a woman matching the description of Elizabeth Short. Also, the book talks about how the owners of the Astor Motel walked into cabin 3 and saw that there was a lot of blood and fecal matter spread out. As to why they didn't report to police, in my mind, I don't know. According to the owner, he did not want to deal with the police at that time, but to me, when you walk into a cabin filled with blood and fecal matter, it's something that I would call police for, This theory, though, is wildly contested by Black Dahlia researchers, including Larry Harnish. Larry Harnish unequivocally states that Leslie Dillon was no doubt about it in San Francisco the night of the murder. So none of these things in the book really matter. But for me, I just say take a look at it if you're into the case. See if you like the theory, see if it grabs you. But nonetheless, it was a good read, and you might enjoy it. Now, here is the motel in question, the Astor Motel that still stands today. I want to thank Rafa Palomo for going out there and getting this footage of the motel, of cabin 3, and the parking lot and everything else. For those that believe the Leslie Dillon theory, this is pretty interesting to take a look at. LAPD's chief forensic specialist, Ray Pinker, and his boys did come and test the rooms here, including cabin 3 at the Astor Motel back then. And the only blood that was found, if I remember correctly, was droplets from when a woman was menstruating. But as far as any trace evidence or any detection of any other blood at the time, it was negative. Now let's talk about Mark Hansen. He was the co-owner of the Florentine Gardens, which still stands there today. Mark had a house nearby to the Florentine Gardens on the back street there on Carlos Avenue, 6024 Carlos Avenue. And it was there that quite a number of the Florentine Garden dancers and entertainers, females mostly, would stay and room there, including Elizabeth Short. And based on another roommate there by the name of Ann Toth, who became a close friend of Elizabeth's, Mark Hansen took a liking to Elizabeth Short. Now, according to him, she didn't mean much to him. According to him, he kicked her out a couple of times, but it has been noted and it has been stated that he had a thing for her. He did take her in a couple of times to stay at his house, but he also did kick her out. Now, he claims the last time he saw her was December 8th. Mark Hansen stated that at one point he had to kick out Elizabeth and her friend Marjorie because Marjorie was drunk a lot, and Elizabeth would bring a lot of undesirables to the house, strange men, according to Mark Hansen, and it just wasn't right, so he had to get them out of there. We do know, at least it's been noted, that in October, Elizabeth stayed at Hansen's house, October of 1946. So clearly, to me, it shows they had some type of relationship, but there was something there that allowed Mark to allow Elizabeth to stay at the house. According to Ann Toth, she stated that Elizabeth told her that Mark is trying to make her, and that Elizabeth told her she would sometimes have to leave her boyfriends or whoever she had with her at the time outside or down the street so Mark didn't see them. Mark did become somewhat of a suspect and was involved in the grand jury investigation, but they couldn't prove anything. Now, probably one of the more popular theories comes from retired LAPD detective Steve Hodel. Steve Hodel claims that his father, George Hodel, is the murderer of Elizabeth Short. And it's quite an extensive investigation that Steve has done, and a lot of work has been put into it. So I commend him for that. When George died, Steve started going through his belongings, sifting through stuff. And what sparked this investigation, or this theory, was that Steve found 2 photos of a woman who he thinks is Elizabeth Short. And from there, it just snowballed into a deeper investigation of his father. So Stephen eventually filed what's called a Freedom of Information Act, and this gave him access to the FBI files on the murder of Elizabeth Short. Steve also found a folder containing receipts that dated back to when his father had contract work done at the house, and these receipts showed that the concrete bought for the contracting work was the same brand and size as the empty concrete sack found at the dump site on Norton Avenue. Now, this house here, known as the John Sowden House at 5121 Franklin Avenue, is Steve Hodel's childhood home. And this house here is a popular fixture when it comes to the Black Dahlia case because of its link to George Hodel. They also call this house the Jaws house because of the Jaws-like fixtures above the door there. According to Steve, a hemicorectomy, I think I'm saying that correctly, was the type of cut used on Elizabeth. And that type of procedure is where you can slice a body in half without breaking any bones. And apparently it was taught sometime in the 1930s when his father was in medical school. Another red flag for Steve was that George's handwriting was very similar to the handwriting in the letters sent to the police. It's also claimed by Steve that her uterus was removed, which I haven't seen in any other reports. Not saying it's not true, but I just haven't seen it. So based on all of that information that Steve presented, it's kind of compelling, just depending on what you believe happened. I mean, there's some stuff in there you definitely got to think about. Probably my favorite theory would be the one by Larry Harnish. Larry Harnish is a former LA Times copy editor and writer. To me, this would make the most plausible sense. He explains it in really good detail on Feast of Death, which is a documentary on James Ellroy and his life and the unsolved murder of James Ellroy's mother, Geneva, which is another podcast that I did, Ghost of LA edition. You might want to check that one out. It's still unsolved, and it happened June 22nd, 1958. It's not as popular, nowhere near as popular as this case, but those 2 murders are pretty similar. At any rate, on Feast of Death, which is a very well done project, Larry Harnish is sitting amongst LA detectives, and with Nick Nolte and with James Ellroy, and they're eating and talking about cases and stuff. And Larry Harnish is getting kind of ribbed by the detectives because they're kicking around some of his theories. They're asking questions that he doesn't really factor in his theory. Now, during Larry's investigation of Elizabeth Short's murder, people were sending him things, and he tells the story where a box came in. He opens it up, and inside of it was a marriage certificate for Virginia Short. Now, Virginia was Elizabeth's older sister. Virginia was getting married to a guy by the name of Adrian West. So, towards the bottom of this marriage certificate is a name, Barbara Lindgren, and an address, 3959 Norton, which is 1 block from where they found Elizabeth. So we dug a lot deeper and found that the woman who owned the house, or who at least was paying taxes on the house, was a woman by the name of Ruth Bailey. Ruth Bailey was the mother of Barbara Lindgren. Ruth Bailey was married to one Walter Bailey. Walter Bailey was a surgeon, former chief of staff at LA County, and an associate professor of surgery at USC. So now you have a very, very solid connection between Elizabeth Short and Barbara Lindgren. That would be Virginia Short. And that's more than a coincidence, in my opinion. And I encourage you to watch Feast of Death. Larry really lays it down, the levels of the research into this case, the levels of what he found out. Here's a Google Earth shot showing you the distance from Walter Bailey's house to where Elizabeth was found, and it was roughly 1,366 feet away. Pretty close. We'll call it 1 block.